The morning it happened, the sky over Harrington Private Airfield was the kind of pale silver that made everything look expensive. Rows of gleaming aircraft lined the tarmac, freshwater white Gulf Streams, matte black Citations, a Bombardier Global 7000 that had cost more than most people would earn in 100 lifetimes. The kind of machines that didn't just fly you from one city to another. They announced you. They told every person watching from the ground exactly what kind of power you carried, exactly how far above the ordinary world you lived. Around 100 of the wealthiest names in aviation, technology, and defense had gathered for the annual Harrington Invitational, a showcase of innovation wrapped inside a day of champagne, closed-door meetings, and quiet billion-dollar handshakes. Security moved in slow, deliberate circuits around the perimeter. Television crews from 3 international networks set up cameras near the main hangar. This was not a place for ordinary people. This was not a place for anything old or worn or quietly extraordinary, which made it exactly the wrong place and exactly the right place for what was about to roll onto runway 3. The old jet appeared at the far end of the tarmac at 8:47 in the morning. And for a moment, nearly everyone stopped talking. Not because it was impressive, because it was so profoundly, almost defiantly, out of place. The aircraft was perhaps 40 years old, by the look of it, a narrow-body twin-engine design that had not been in commercial production since before most of the people watching it were born. Its fuselage was painted in what might once have been brilliant silver, but had weathered into something more honest than that, a matte, slightly oxidized surface that caught the morning light and held it without giving anything back. A long hairline fracture ran through the paint along the left stabilizer. One of the forward access panels had been replaced at some point with a slightly different shade of aluminum. It moved across the tarmac with a low, almost gentle sound, engines turning over so quietly that several of the engineers watching glanced at each other, suddenly uncertain whether the jet was actually running at full power or merely coasting. Walking beside it, one hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder, was a man named Ethan Hayes. He was 43 years old. He wore clean dark jeans, a gray long-sleeve shirt, and a jacket that had been good once and still was. His daughter Lily was 8. She wore a red coat and carried a small backpack shaped like a penguin. And she looked at the other aircraft the way children look at things they find beautiful but do not yet understand the price of. The laughter started near the main hospitality pavilion, where the most important guests had gathered with their morning coffee and their morning certainty. It wasn't cruel laughter at first, more the reflexive, helpless kind that comes when something is simply so unexpected that the body doesn't know what else to do. A few people pulled out their phones. A photographer from one of the aviation trade publications raised his camera and then lowered it again, not quite sure what to do with what he was seeing. And then Vanessa Cole spoke. And the morning shifted. Vanessa Cole was 38 years old, and she had spent every one of those years making sure nobody in any room she entered would ever have a reason to underestimate her again. She was the founder and chief executive of Cole Aerospace, a technology company that had grown in 7 years from a startup operating out of a rented office in Austin to a publicly traded corporation valued at $2.4 billion. She had been on the cover of 4 major business magazines in the last 3 years. She had testified before Senate committees on the future of sustainable aviation. She was photographed regularly at the kind of events where photographs mean something. She was, by every measure that the world she inhabited used to measure such things, extraordinary. She was also standing approximately 40 feet from Ethan Hayes when she said it loudly enough that the people around her heard it, loudly enough that the photographer's head came back up, loudly enough that Lily's hand tightened slightly inside her father's. "Is that thing actually cleared for flight?" Vanessa said, her voice carrying the easy, almost musical quality of someone who has never once worried about being overheard. "I thought the scrapyard was on the other side of the field." The laughter that followed was different from the first kind. It had edges. A reporter made a note. One of Vanessa's associates leaned in and said something that produced a second, shorter laugh. Another executive took a long photograph of the old jet, with Ethan standing beside it. Ethan Hayes heard every word. He did not stop walking. He did not look toward Vanessa Cole. He placed his hand more gently on Lily's shoulder, and kept moving. And his expression was something that a careful observer might have described as patience, the specific, practiced patience of someone who has learned that the moment rarely belongs to the person who speaks the loudest. Lily looked up at him. Her small face was turned slightly downward, the way a child's face turns when something has been said, and the child is working out what it means. Ethan squeezed her shoulder once, softly, and they kept walking. What very few people in that crowd knew, and what almost none of them had thought to wonder about, was who Ethan Hayes actually was. Not the man standing on the tarmac in clean dark jeans. The man underneath that, the one who had spent 15 years inside one of the most specialized and demanding disciplines in the world, designing propulsion systems for aircraft at a level of precision that put him in a category inhabited by perhaps 24 people alive. The man who had once produced a theoretical model for variable compression fuel cycling that 3 separate aerospace engineering departments had quietly admitted they could not replicate. The man who had walked away from all of it, not because he failed, but because the world he loved had done something unforgivable to him, and he had decided that some things matter more than being right in rooms full of important people. Near the edge of the crowd, a man in his mid-60s stood apart from the others with a cup of coffee he had not touched. His name was Dr. Raymond Holt, a former systems architect who had spent 30 years at the outer edges of aerospace research, the kind of career built in technical papers rather than press releases. He was watching the silver jet with an expression that was not amusement and not disdain. His eyes moved along the fuselage slowly, tracking the engine nacelles, the intake geometry, the specific and unusual curve of the exhaust configuration. His lips moved very slightly, as if he were performing calculations that he did not want anyone else to see. Then, almost to himself, barely audible beneath the noise of the crowd and the hum of real money moving through the morning air, he said something that only the man standing immediately beside him heard. "That's impossible," Raymond Holt said. "That's the HX-1. The man who had walked away from aviation had not, in fact, walked away from aviation. He had simply moved it somewhere no one thought to look. Ethan Hayes had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 children in a family that ran a small aircraft maintenance business. Not glamorous work, but honest, precise work, the kind that teaches you that machines have integrity and will tell you the truth if you know how to listen. He had studied aerospace engineering at Purdue on scholarship, graduated near the top of his class, and been recruited directly into a private research division that no longer publicly exists. For 6 years, he designed things that most people in commercial aviation would not see for another decade. He was, by the clinical assessment of his colleagues at the time, genuinely gifted, not the manageable, productive kind of gifted that organizations know how to use, but the rarer, more inconvenient kind that tends to arrive at answers before the organization is ready to hear them. He met a woman named Sarah in his 2nd year there. She was a physicist, quiet, precise, and funny, in ways that took you a moment to catch up to. They married 3 years later and began working together in the evenings on a project that was purely theirs, not owned by any company, not funded by any contract. Just 2 people who believed a specific thing was possible and wanted to find out if they were right. The project was a propulsion system, a variable efficiency, hydrogen hybrid engine designed to retrofit into existing narrow-body airframes. The theoretical fuel efficiency gains were so far outside the range of what anyone in the industry considered achievable that when Ethan first presented the preliminary data to his division head, the man had laughed not cruelly, but with the genuine, unguarded amusement of someone who has just been told something that cannot be true. Then he had looked at the numbers again and stopped laughing. What followed was a period of Ethan's life that he does not discuss in detail, and that Lily knows only in broad outline, the version a careful parent gives a child when the truth is too angular for small hands to hold. A larger company became aware of the project. Conversations happened. Agreements were presented. Ethan and Sarah declined to sign. The larger company had lawyers. It had patents of its own that overlapped in ways Ethan had not anticipated. It had, ultimately, more patience for this kind of attrition than 2 independent researchers working in the evenings after their day jobs. The project was not stolen in any clean, dramatic way. It was eroded, picked apart, made legally complicated until it became practically impossible. And then Sarah got sick. The diagnosis arrived in early spring, and the world that Ethan had been living in, the one made of propulsion models and patent filings and quiet fury at institutional injustice, simply ceased to be the most important world. He left the company. He moved Sarah to a quieter city. He learned to cook things she could eat during the treatment months. He learned what the night shift of caring for someone you love actually costs, not in money, but in the particular currency of presence, of being entirely available to another person in ways that leave nothing remaining for anything else. Lily was born in the middle of all of it, which sounds impossible, and was, in fact, the most ordinary kind of miracle. Sarah held her daughter for the first time in a hospital room and said she was exactly what she had been expecting. She died 14 months later, in the same hospital, on a Tuesday morning while Ethan held her hand and Lily slept in a carrier on his chest. Ethan had not returned to the industry. He had taken his daughter home, and he had started over slowly, quietly, in a way that required him to rebuild the idea of what a good life could look like from very basic materials. He repaired other people's aircraft. He ran a small maintenance workshop. He took Lily to school in the mornings and picked her up in the afternoons, and cooked dinner in the evenings and read to her before bed. And in the back of the workshop, under a tarp that was 7 years old and beginning to develop its own character, sat the aircraft that he and Sarah had built together, not the technology, which existed in the jet systems, but the jet itself, the physical object, which had always been theirs, and which no company had ever had the legal standing to claim. There was one other thing Ethan had built in the workshop. In addition to the aircraft, he had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a retreat, a man who had stepped back from ambition and chosen simplicity. But it was not simplicity he had chosen, it was priority. He had decided what the most important things were, and he had organized his existence around them with the same precision and discipline he had once applied to propulsion models. Lily was the most important thing. After Lily came the work, not the commercial work, the maintenance and repair that paid the bills, but the real work, the ongoing development of the HX-1 system, which he had never stopped refining in the hours after Lily went to bed. He had filled 9 engineering notebooks in the years since Sarah died. He had made improvements to the original design that Sarah herself would not have anticipated. The aircraft that sat under the tarp in the back of the workshop was not frozen in the moment of its original creation. It had grown, incrementally, quietly, the way anything grows when someone who loves it pays consistent attention. The technology it contained in the year of the Harrington Airfield event was meaningfully more advanced than the technology Sarah and Ethan had originally developed together. He had, in effect, spent a decade and a half continuing a conversation that the world had tried to end. In a city that moves by the rhythms of money and attention, Vanessa Cole was preparing for what she privately considered the most important week of her professional life. Her company, Cole Aerospace, had been burning through capital at a rate that was not yet visible to the public, but that her CFO brought up in every private meeting with the controlled, careful urgency of someone who is beginning to lose confidence in their own composure. The core problem was fuel costs. Cole Aerospace had built its valuation on a fleet management platform software that optimized routing and scheduling for private and charter aviation clients. And that platform's revenue model was directly exposed to fuel price volatility in a way that had seemed manageable 3 years ago, and now seemed structural. The company needed either a proprietary solution to the fuel problem or a partnership that would allow it to claim one. Vanessa had 3 potential investors arriving at Harrington this week, each of whom had been told a version of Cole Aerospace's future that was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. She was not lying. She was, in the language of her world, managing a narrative. She had been managing narratives, in one form or another, for most of her adult life. She had grown up in circumstances that she did not discuss, and did not allow to be discussed, a specific kind of working-class childhood, in a specific kind of Texas town, where the primary lesson available to a girl who was too smart and too stubborn for her surroundings was that the world will not make room for you willingly. You have to take the room. You have to take it loudly, and you have to keep taking it, because the moment you show anything that looks like uncertainty, the world will fill the space you've left with someone who is less capable but more comfortable with the sound of their own authority. Vanessa had learned this lesson completely. She had learned it so completely that it had become her, in the way that armor eventually becomes the body wearing it. In the weeks following the airfield humiliation, the video appeared. A young contract engineer named Marcus Webb had been working near runway 3 when the old silver jet performed its taxi test, and he had done what anyone under 30 does when they witness something unexpected. He filmed it. The footage was unremarkable for the first 20 seconds. Then the jet powered up toward takeoff thrust, and something happened that Marcus had not expected and could not immediately explain. The sound was wrong. Not broken wrong. Not mechanically distressed. Wrong in a cleaner direction, quieter than it should have been. Smoother, with none of the characteristic frequency signatures that anyone who has spent time near jet engines learns to expect. The aircraft climbed out at a rate that the wind shear data for that morning should not have supported. Marcus posted the video that evening with a short, uncertain caption. "Something's different about this engine. Engineers, help me out." By the following morning, it had been shared by 4 aviation enthusiasts with significant audiences. By the following evening, it was in front of people who understood what they were looking at. The comments split immediately into 2 camps: the dismissive, which used words like audio compression and camera distortion, and the alarmed, which used words like, "that climb rate isn't possible," and "what is happening with those exhaust readings." A retired propulsion specialist, with 30 years at a major aerospace manufacturer, posted a 4-paragraph analysis that ended with a single sentence: "If this footage is genuine and unmodified, what I am looking at represents an efficiency profile that the current state of commercial aviation cannot produce." That post was shared 12,000 times in 6 hours. Ethan did not know any of this was happening. He was helping Lily with a school project about migratory birds. Sitting at the kitchen table with a large sheet of paper and a set of colored markers, explaining that the reason birds can fly such extraordinary distances has to do with the specific shape of their wings and the way they read the air rather than fight it. At school, a boy named Connor told Lily that her dad drove a flying garbage truck. Lily did not respond. She held her pencil very tightly and looked at the classroom wall and decided she was not going to cry, and she did not. That evening, her father's name was trending in 3 countries. She did not know that either. The offer from Dubai came through a formal channel, a letter, delivered by courier, from a holding company representing a consortium of Gulf aviation investors. $50 million for the aircraft and its proprietary systems, with a secondary clause offering an additional consulting arrangement valued at $3 million annually. Ethan read the letter twice at his kitchen table, then folded it and placed it under a coffee mug, and went to make Lily's lunch for the next day. That evening, Lily asked him why he looked different, not sad, but somewhere adjacent to sad, like a person working out a problem that doesn't fit on paper. He told her someone had offered to buy the jet. Lily thought about this seriously, in the way she thought about most things, with her chin slightly raised and her eyes moving to the middle distance. "Which jet?" she asked, knowing perfectly well which jet. "The one in the back," he said. She was quiet. Then she said, "Mom helped you make that one." Ethan said yes. Lily said, "So, it's not really just yours to sell, is it?" He called the consortium's representative back the following morning and declined, politely and without extensive explanation. The representative asked if there was a number that would change his answer. Ethan said he didn't think the number was the issue. The representative thanked him and disconnected. By noon, the story of the refusal was in 3 industry publications. By 3 in the afternoon, Vanessa Cole's investor relations team was sending her a report that contained the phrase, "significant competitive concern." By 5 o'clock, Vanessa was in her car outside Ethan's workshop, sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off. Deciding whether to go inside, she went inside. The workshop smelled of metal and machine oil, and something she could not immediately identify, something warmer, almost domestic, as if the space had been lived in so thoroughly that it had absorbed the character of the person living it. Tools hung on a pegboard in a system that had clearly been developed over years, not organized for appearance but for use. Each thing in the exact place where a person who knew what they were doing would expect to find it. A child's drawing was taped to the edge of a metal shelf, a blue aircraft with large round windows, and a stick figure waving from the cockpit. And below it, in careful first-grade handwriting, the words, "Dad's plane." The paper was old enough that the tape had yellowed at the corners. Vanessa looked at it for 1 second longer than she meant to. Ethan looked up from the workbench without surprise, as if he had been expecting this visit or something very like it, and gestured toward a stool near the wall without speaking. Vanessa had prepared for this meeting. She had thought about what she would say and how she would say it, the specific combination of professional acknowledgement and strategic offer that she had used in a dozen acquisition conversations and that had, in every previous case, landed exactly as intended. She had not prepared for the quality of the silence in the room. She made her offer. It was comprehensive purchase of the aircraft, licensing rights to the propulsion technology, an engineering consultancy arrangement for Ethan at a salary that represented more money than his workshop generated in 4 years. She delivered it cleanly and waited. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He set down the tool he was holding. He looked at his hands briefly, the way people look at their hands when they are choosing words. Then he said, very simply, "You called it a piece of junk." Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. "You weren't talking about the aircraft." Ethan continued, his voice carrying no particular heat, no anger, no performance, just the flat and unflinching weight of a true thing. "You were talking about me, and about my daughter, who was standing right there." Vanessa said she had not intended. Ethan said he understood. Then he said, "You only see what something is worth when you think you can buy it. You didn't see that plane at all. You still don't." He walked back to his workbench. Vanessa sat on the stool for a moment longer. And in the quality of that moment, in the specific texture of being in a room where someone has declined to perform anger at you, declined to make it dramatic, simply stated the truth, and returned to work. She felt something happen inside her that she could not name and did not like. She left without making a second offer. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 11 minutes before starting the engine. The Japanese consortium's offer arrived 4 days later. $80 million. Ethan declined by email, in 3 sentences. The global coverage that followed was not the kind Vanessa Cole was accustomed to. For the first 2 years of Cole Aerospace's public existence, every major story about her company had been, in some fundamental sense, a story about her, her vision, her leadership, her trajectory. Now the cameras were facing a different direction. The aviation press, the technology press, and eventually the general press were all running versions of the same story. The widowed engineer, who built a revolutionary aircraft in a small workshop and turned down $100 million in offers before the bidding was complete. They ran photographs of the silver jet, alongside renders of the latest Gulfstream. They ran quotes from aerospace engineers who had reviewed the publicly available data, the video, the climb rate analysis, the exhaust signature, and who used phrases like paradigm shifting and 2 decades ahead of any comparable commercial technology. The aviation press, the technology press, and eventually the general press were all running versions of the same story. The widowed engineer who built a revolutionary aircraft in a small workshop and turned down $100 million in offers before the bidding was complete. They ran photographs of the silver jet, alongside renders of the latest Gulfstream. They ran quotes from aerospace engineers who had reviewed the publicly available data, the video, the climb rate analysis, the exhaust signature, and who used phrases like paradigm shifting and 2 decades ahead of any comparable commercial technology. The story had a quality that most stories lack: the specific gravity of something that is not only true but also just. People who had never previously given any thought to propulsion efficiency or aviation fuel economics found themselves reading long technical analyses at midnight and sharing them with the comment, "You have to read this." The algorithm did what algorithms do when something has genuine emotional weight behind it. It moved the story everywhere at once, into feeds and timelines and conversations it had no obvious reason to enter. A woman in Minneapolis shared the video with her father, a retired commercial pilot, who watched it 4 times and called it the most interesting thing he had seen since he left flying. A teenager in Seoul did a 3-minute video response, explaining the technical details in language designed for people who don't speak engineering, which was viewed 4 million times in 48 hours. The story was global before Ethan had finished helping Lily understand why Arctic terns migrate 12,000 miles instead of finding somewhere warmer to spend the winter. And somewhere in the third week, a researcher at a business publication pulled the original video clip, the one from Harrington Airfield, and noticed something in the background. There was Vanessa Cole, mid-laugh, 6 feet from Ethan Hayes and his daughter. The clip had already been viewed, in various forms, approximately 4 million times. After the publication ran a piece connecting Vanessa's laugh to the now famous aircraft, it was viewed 11 million more. Vanessa's communications team issued a statement that was carefully worded. It did not land well. Her stock dropped 4% in 2 days. 2 of her institutional investors requested calls. The board scheduled a meeting that was described in the invitation as a strategic alignment review, which is a phrase that in her experience always means something is about to be realigned in a direction she has not chosen. Vanessa's communications team issued a statement. It was carefully worded. It did not land well. Her stock dropped 4% in 2 days. 2 of her institutional investors requested calls. The board scheduled a meeting that was described in the invitation as a strategic alignment review, which is a phrase that, in her experience, always means something is about to be realigned in a direction she has not chosen. She sat alone in her office after the board call and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass and allowed herself, for the first time in several years, to feel the precise weight of the ground beneath her. The version of herself that had stood at Harrington Airfield and laughed at a silver jet, that version felt very close right now, very present, closer than she wanted. She had been so certain of herself that morning. She had been standing in the exact center of the world she had built, surrounded by the people whose approval she had spent a decade earning, and something old and small and familiar had moved through her, the instinct to establish territory, to announce herself, to be the person in the room who knows what things are worth before anyone else has finished looking at them. She knew that instinct. She had been running from it and running on it simultaneously for her entire adult life. It was the part of herself she had built the most carefully, the quickness, the confidence, the ability to read a room and respond to it faster than anyone expected. It was also, she understood now, in the 48 hours of watching the world realign itself around a man she had dismissed in 15 careless seconds, the part of herself that had caused her the most damage. She had grown up in a town called Mineral Springs, 40 minutes from nowhere in particular, in a house with 3 bedrooms and 1 functioning bathroom, and a father who worked 2 jobs and still never seemed to outrun the distance between what the family needed and what they had. Her father's name was Richard Cole. He had been, before the jobs and the distance, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped expecting things to improve, an engineer, not a practicing one. He hadn't finished his degree. But the instinct was there, and Vanessa had grown up understanding the shape of it. The way he looked at machines, the way he talked about them, the reverence he had for things that worked correctly, and the specific frustration he had for things that worked almost correctly, which he considered a moral failing on someone's part. He had told her, once, when she was 12, that he had almost been part of something important, that he had known a man with an idea that could change aviation permanently, that the idea had been destroyed by money, not by science, that the man with the idea had survived, but the idea had gone underground. Vanessa had filed this story in the category of things her father said when he was tired and looking for something to blame. She had moved on. She had built a life specifically designed to be the opposite of the one she had grown up inside. And now, sitting in her office with the weight of her board's concern pressing on her from every direction, she opened her laptop and typed a name she had not searched in 17 years. Richard Cole. Aerospace. She found the papers. They were old technical collaboration agreements from a research partnership that had apparently dissolved under commercial pressure decades ago. There were 3 signatories. One of them was her father. One of them was a physicist named Sarah Malone. The third was a man named Ethan Hayes. She drove to the workshop before she had decided she was going to. She parked and sat, and then got out and walked to the door without letting herself hesitate, because hesitation in front of a door she was afraid to open was not something she had ever permitted herself. Ethan was inside. Lily was there too, sitting on a crate doing homework. And she looked up at Vanessa with the steady, assessing gaze of a child who has not yet been taught to be polite about things she doesn't trust. Vanessa asked if she could speak with Ethan. Ethan told Lily to take her homework to the break room, which had a better table. Lily gathered her things slowly and went. Vanessa placed the papers on the workbench. Ethan looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, exactly, but opened slightly. The way a window opens. He told her about her father. He told her in the way that someone tells a story they have been carrying for a long time and are not certain they should be carrying alone. Richard Cole had been the one who believed most completely. He had taken time off his second job to attend the early meetings. He had run calculations at a kitchen table, very much like the one in Ethan's house. He had argued, when the legal pressure came, that they should fight, that the technology was too important to surrender to commercial interests, that there would be consequences for the world's atmosphere, and for the economics of flight, for generations, if this particular idea was buried. He had been right. The idea had been buried anyway. Richard Cole had spent the years after in the specific diminishment that comes from having believed in something significant and watched it be taken from the world, not by a better idea, but by a worse set of interests with more patience. He had died 8 years ago of a heart condition that his doctor told Vanessa had been worsened by chronic stress. Vanessa sat on the same stool she had sat on 3 weeks earlier. And this time, she did not get up for a while. Ethan did not rush her. When she cried, he gave her the time to do it without making it into something. When she was done, he handed her a cloth that was not entirely clean, and she took it without comment. He was a good man, Ethan said. He cared more about whether the thing was right than whether he would get credit for it. Vanessa looked at the papers on the workbench. "I've been trying to become someone no one would ever talk to the way he talked to himself," she said. Ethan was quiet. Then he said, "You became someone who talked to other people that way instead." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her in years. She did not argue. The buyer who offered $100 million was not a name that appeared in the aviation press. It surfaced through a financial analyst who noticed a series of shell company formations that traced back through 7 degrees of separation to an energy holding company with significant petroleum assets. The offer came through a law firm and was structured as a full acquisition: the aircraft, the technology, all associated intellectual property, all research documentation, all future development rights. The $100 million was not generosity. It was containment. Raymond Holt, who had stayed in Ethan's orbit since the morning at Harrington Airfield and had become, in the weeks since, something between a consultant and an informal advocate, recognized the structure immediately. He had seen similar formations before, not in aviation, but in energy, in the years when certain renewable technologies had been acquired and quietly shelved by companies whose core revenue depended on the problem those technologies would have solved. The pattern was recognizable if you knew to look for it. The generous number, the clean structure, the unusual urgency, the absence of any stated development plan. Nobody pays that much for something they intend to use. They pay that much for something they intend to own. He called Ethan at 11 in the evening to explain what he was looking at. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then, he said he needed to think. He sat in the workshop after the call, the aircraft under its lights, the engines silent, and he thought about all the mornings Sarah had sat beside him at this bench. He thought about what she had believed the technology could do, not for their careers, not for their bank account, but for the particular problem of a world that was slowly warming itself into a corner it might not be able to leave. The aviation industry, Sarah had always said, was one of the most stubborn carbon problems in the global economy, precisely because it was also one of the most difficult to solve. You cannot put a battery in an aircraft the way you put one in a car. The physics are different, the constraints are different, the energy density required is different. What the HX-1 addressed was the fuel itself, the efficiency of its conversion, the reduction of its waste, the narrowing of the gap between the energy available in the hydrogen carrier and the energy actually delivered to the thrust equation. If you could bring that gap down far enough, you could change the math for the entire industry. Sarah had understood this before Ethan fully did. She had seen the end state clearly, the way physicists sometimes see the destination before the engineers have found the road. He thought about Lily, who was 8 years old and would be alive in this world for a very long time. Longer than him, long enough that the decisions being made right now about energy and atmosphere and aviation would be the conditions of her adult life. He did not make the decision that night. He made it the next morning. Standing in the kitchen making Lily's breakfast, watching her drag her penguin backpack toward the door with the confident inefficiency of a child who has not yet learned to hurry. The answer was not complicated, once he stopped looking for a way to make it profitable on both sides. Vanessa Cole appeared at the press conference Ethan called 4 days later. She had not been invited. She had called him and asked if he would allow it, and he had said yes, without asking why she wanted to be there, which was itself a kind of answer. She stood to the left of the podium while Ethan, who had never held a press conference in his life and looked exactly like someone who had never held a press conference in his life, explained his decision. He spoke slowly and without rhetorical flourish, which is the way people speak when they are saying something they have thought about for a long time and no longer need to convince themselves of. He was not selling the HX-1 technology to any single buyer. He was entering into a licensing structure developed with Raymond Holt and a small team of intellectual property attorneys that would make the core technology available to any certified aircraft manufacturer or research institution at a regulated royalty rate, with anti-monopolization clauses that prevented any single entity from acquiring exclusive rights. The room was full of reporters and analysts who had been covering the bidding war with the avidity of people watching a very expensive sport. And for a moment after he finished speaking, there was a silence that had a different quality from ordinary silence, the kind that comes when something unexpected has happened and the room is still catching up to it. Then Vanessa stepped forward. She had written what she wanted to say, and then thrown it away and written it again, and thrown it away again. And in the end she stood at the podium and said it without notes. That she had been wrong about the aircraft. That she had been wrong about the man. That the morning at Harrington Airfield had been one of the worst things she had done in a professional career that she had previously been confident to characterize as ethical. She said it was not enough to admit that. She said she intended to demonstrate it. Cole Aerospace, she announced, would be the first company to formally apply for a license under Ethan's new structure and would commit to a development timeline that would bring HX-1 derivative technology into its fleet management platform within 18 months. The room produced a different kind of noise after that. Not applause exactly, more the sound of recalibration happening out loud. Lily watched the press conference from a tablet that her teacher had set up in the front of the classroom because 3 of the other students' parents had messaged the school to ask if it would be possible to watch it together. Connor, who had said the thing about the flying garbage truck, sat in the second row with his arms folded and did not look at Lily. Lily looked at the screen. She watched her father stand at the podium and speak in his quiet, careful voice, and she watched the reporters write things down. And she thought about her mother, not a specific memory, because she was too young to have those with any reliable detail, but the idea of her mother, which was warm and clear and present in a way that was its own kind of knowing. She thought her mother would have liked today. She thought her mother would have said something dry and precise about it that would have taken a moment to fully arrive. When the classroom erupted in the complicated noise of 30 children processing something they are old enough to know is significant, but young enough not to fully understand, Lily sat very still in her seat and let herself feel what she felt, which was a form of pride that was so large it did not fit easily inside an 8-year-old's chest. 30 days after the morning at Harrington Airfield, the Silver Jet sat in a hangar at a facility outside Denver, where a team of 12 engineers, some of them among the most decorated in their fields, had been working for 3 weeks to fully document and verify the HX-1 propulsion system. The aircraft had been repainted, not to cover the old silver, but to restore it a careful conservation rather than a renovation, the kind of work that honors what something has been rather than disguising it. The hairline fracture along the stabilizer had been addressed but not erased. The slightly mismatched access panel remained. The jet looked exactly like what it was, a 40-year-old aircraft that had been built by 2 people who believed in something, maintained by a man who had not stopped believing in it, and operated for the entire duration of its career, in complete indifference to whether anyone was watching. Raymond Holt had called it, in an interview with an aerospace journal, the most significant propulsion development since the introduction of high-bypass turbofan engines in the 1960s. 3 governments had made inquiries about the licensing framework. A university in Zurich had already submitted its research application. The Energy Consortium, whose offer had been declined, did not comment publicly. Vanessa Cole's company had regained the ground it had lost in the stock market, and then gained more. On the strength of the licensing announcement and the first confirmed technical partnership, she had restructured her board with 2 new members who understood propulsion engineering. She had also, in a meeting that was not announced and not photographed, gone to the workshop and helped Ethan clean it. Not as a gesture, as the first item on a list of things she owed that was long and specific, and that she intended to work through carefully. They had worked side by side for 3 hours in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and when they were done, Ethan had made coffee, and they had sat on opposite sides of his workbench and talked about what her father had been like in the early days, the optimism of him, the specific pleasure he took in a calculation that resolved cleanly. The way he had believed without needing to be convinced. On the 31st day, Ethan Hayes took Lily to the airfield early, before the engineers arrived, when the light was still low and gold and the hangar was quiet. He showed her the aircraft, the restored surfaces, the engine housings, the particular geometry of the intake design that had been her mother's contribution, the part that Sarah had spent 3 years refining in the evenings after work. He explained it to her in language that an 8-year-old can hold, because he believed that the truth, properly translated, is not too large for anyone. He told her about the variable compression. He told her about the hydrogen hybrid cycling system, describing it as something like breathing the engine taking in what it needs in exactly the rhythm that the air allows, rather than forcing the exchange. He told her that what made it different from every other engine that had been built was not brute efficiency, but a kind of listening. The system was designed to read the conditions of flight and adapt continuously, the way a living thing adapts, rather than operating at fixed parameters the way a machine is usually expected to. He told her that her mother had contributed the core mathematical model for that listening function, that Sarah had seen the relationship between variable atmospheric density and fuel conversion efficiency as a physics problem first, an engineering problem second, and had solved the physics part in a way that no one else in the field had managed, because no one else had been approaching it from that particular angle. She thought like a physicist, Ethan said. That's why she saw things the engineers missed. Lily listened to all of this. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the seam where the old paint met the restored, feeling the continuity of the surface beneath her palm, the unbroken line of something that had been built with care and had survived being ignored and was still, fundamentally, exactly itself. She asked if they could go up. Ethan said not today. There were still certifications outstanding, still formal processes to complete, still a world of paperwork between the thing and its permission to move through the sky in the official way rather than the quiet, careful way Ethan had been flying it for years. Lily said okay. She accepted this with the particular equanimity of a child who has grown up around a patient person and has absorbed patience by proximity. She looked at the aircraft for a moment longer, the morning light coming through the hangar doors and catching the silver in a way that made it look, for a moment, like something that had always been worth exactly this much, not more because of the attention, not less because of the years of obscurity, simply what it was, which had always been enough. I knew you'd prove it, she said, not to anyone in particular. The way a child says something when they have always known it, and are simply noting the moment when the world caught up. Ethan looked at his daughter. He thought about Sarah, who was not in the room and was in the room. The way people are when they have left something significant behind. He thought about the morning at Harrington Airfield, the laughter, the turned faces, the sound of Lily's hand tightening in his. He thought about the version of himself that had almost sold the technology to make the difficulty stop. He thought about what it cost to believe in something past the point where belief is comfortable, past the point where the world has given you several clear opportunities to set it down. Outside the hangar, the sky was doing what skies do, in the early morning, opening slowly, going from gray to gold, to the first bright, unconditional blue of a full day. Somewhere behind him, the first of the engineering team arrived. Footsteps on the concrete, voices low and purposeful. The world that had laughed was now assembling itself around the thing it had laughed at. That is the ordinary shape of how the important things happen. Quietly, in workshops, by people who have decided that the work matters more than the recognition, who have held on to the thing through the years when no one was watching, and the years when no one believed, until the morning arrives when the light is right, and the sky is ready, and the silver jet lifts off, and the sound it makes is nothing like what anyone expected. Softer, cleaner, more like permission than propulsion, and the people watching from the ground go very still, because they have just heard something they cannot explain. And for a moment the world is open. The voice of the machine carries. It always has. The world simply needed to learn how to listen.